Welcome to Lecture 18 in Communication 1110, Fundamentals of Speech. In the last lecture, we looked at one of the channels of communication, more specifically, and that is discussed in Chapter 12. And in this lecture, we're going to look at nonverbal communication, everything except the voice part of it, which will be in Lecture 19. And that is referring to Chapter 13 in the textbook. Nonverbal communication refers to messages sent without or beyond words. That's the definition. And when you think about it, you can see that that's a very large area of communication. We're not always aware of it, but it's very large. As I've mentioned before, a scholar in the 1960s named Alfred Morabian said that 93% of our emotional meaning is nonverbal. We cannot communicate ideas and facts very well nonverbally, but we communicate our attitudes and view of people and our emotions very clearly through nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication, and different people, of course, will experience these in different ways. First of all, nonverbal communication complements or completes the meaning of the verbal, in which case it adds to the meaning of the words, doesn't detract from it, it adds to it. For example, you might add a gesture when you say something. On the other hand, nonverbal communication often contradicts what we say, and we send out conflicting messages at times. For example, if you ask me, how do I feel, and I say, fine, that doesn't sound like I really do feel fine. In many cases, nonverbal communication is also used to substitute for the verbal. We might not say anything, but our facial expression says it all. We may gesture someone to come here, but not actually say, come here. And of course, there are codified meanings to everything we do in a culture. If I say, come here like this, that's very different than like this, especially with my face being different, as opposed to, okay, those are three different ways of saying come here, but the words would be the same. So finally, the last function of nonverbal communication is that it controls the verbal, the flow of the verbal, if you will. And I think the best example of this is how people nowadays, you'll be having a conversation with them and all of a sudden they pull out their cell phone and start texting. And that makes me want to stop talking. Other things people do, like turning away, not having eye contact, getting up, standing up, are ways of making the verbal communication stop or influencing it. Nonverbal communication is therefore helpful, but it's often not understood very well. In a system, in a communication system, as we learned earlier, communication is inevitable. The saying is, you cannot not communicate. You're always sending out these nonverbal messages, even when you're unconscious of them, to other people. And you're also taking them in, sometimes unconsciously, from other people. The inferences we make from nonverbal communication may not be correct. They may be quite wrong, but we're still taking them in. For example, if I scratch my head, you could say, well, that's just a nervous thing she does, a repeated sort of non-verbal communication. It may be the way she communicates, I don't understand. Or some people might say she has something wrong with her head. She has a bug in her hair. So that's different ways that can be interpreted. Therefore, we're not always aware that we're sending out these nonverbal messages, and nonverbal communication presents some problems for us. We cannot always control what we send out and what people take from it. One reason that you're taking a public speaking course is so that you can get used to the idea that how you look in front of people does affect your how you come across. So that's why it's a good idea to film yourself giving a speech. It's very informative. You might see yourself making the same gesture over and over again that you were unaware of, and even start to get on your own nerves looking at it. Usually in class at this point, I show some open-ended photographs, and we talk about what we see versus what's actually going on. And it's interesting to listen to the students because they always want to confuse what they see with what they interpret, and it's not the same. If you're looking at the PowerPoints, you can see that there's a picture of, it looks like a business meeting, or actually it's the aftermath of a business meeting or a break. And there are people, they're wearing suits, business attire, and there are two gentlemen, they're looking at a screen, and there's one gentleman that appears to be looking at a notebook. And it's interesting how people interpret that based on the physical closeness of the two fellows looking at the screen, and the fact that they're smiling, and the other fella is working. He looks serious. Now, in American culture, people tend to interpret that after they look at it as the two fellas looking at the screen are goofing off and looking at funny YouTube videos, and the fella on the side is working hard. But actually, in another culture, their behavior would be interpreted differently. They would see the two fellows working together as being happy about their work, and they are working as a team, whereas the other fellow is being, he's not a team member. He is isolating himself, and that's not a good value in a different culture. So what we'll see here is that nonverbal communication is highly cultural in meaning, and we also tend to not see things, we just interpret them quickly instead of really thinking about what we're seeing. Scholars who study nonverbal communication have come up with several different categories, and we're going to look at 7 of them, 6 of them in this lecture, and then we'll look at vocalics in the next one. That brings us to subpoint A, that the first category of nonverbal communication is kinesics, K-I-N-E-S-I-C-S. And that refers to body language. I often refer to it as everything from the neck down. And there would be gestures and posture for the most part. You've already seen in class how important these are to public speaking, that it's good if someone uses gestures. It's good if someone walks around. Also, I really fuss at you about posture. I don't want you hanging off the lectern as if it's part of your skeletal system. You need to be independent of it. The lectern is just for your notes, not for your body to hang off of. You want your gestures to be strong and definite. You don't want little flappy gestures. They should be strong. They should be above your waist. Some of you are more comfortable with gestures than others, and that's fine, but don't feel like you shouldn't use gestures, because gestures help the audience pay attention and they help your speech seem more natural. If you are seated, for example, at a job interview, you want your posture, your seated posture, to be open, direct, erect, and but relaxed. You don't want to be perched on the edge of a chair, but you also don't want to do the turning to the side or crossing your arms or crossing your legs away from people. That's a negative, it sends out a negative message. Kinesics, interestingly enough, is tied to status. People with higher status are usually taller, or at least have taller, more erect posture. They're strong, they feel secure in themselves. I notice a lot of people tend to sink down, and they, you know, their shoulders are down. Pull back, you're going to look a lot more confident in yourself. People of higher status will use more gestures. They will take up more space with their gestures. They're comfortable with their bodies. People with lower status, or who are conscious of their lower status, tend to not want to take up too much space, and they're not as relaxed. People with higher status are more relaxed and less tense. You might think again of a job interview. The applicant probably looks more nervous, more tense than the interviewer, who is in control. Another interesting story about this is the Rosa Parks situation in 1955, in the Montgomery bus boycott. Ms. Parks, being a woman in a Southern culture, should have been given the status, of course, to be seated, but because she was African American and she had lower status in that culture, she was expected to stand up. The seated person in our culture usually has more status, and I guess that goes back to the king or something. But in her situation, she was not given that, and that was the impetus for some of the civil rights movement. So that is the kinesics, and kinesics and body language is a very interesting study. The next one is oculesics, O-C-U-L-E-S-I-C-S, and this has to do with eye behavior. Okay, what does your eyes do? Now you know that in Western culture, eye contact is very important. That while we don't want you to stare somebody down, looking at somebody in the eye is seen as forthright, honest, self-confident, these kinds of things. And lack of eye contact is seen as nervous or unsure or being dishonest about what you're saying. However, this is a Western value, and in Asian cultures, they don't see it that way. Looking somebody directly in the eye is, the way we do, is traditionally seen there as an affront, and it's not polite. So you should be aware of that if you're dealing with someone from another culture, that their standards are not the same as ours. Other cultures, interestingly enough, look more closely at the eye and whether the pupil dilates or not, because they know that that indicates psychological state. A practical application of oculesics is one that really kind of bothers me a little bit, is if you're in a meeting with a group of people, it's really best if you can have a round table as opposed to one of those traditional boardroom tables, because in that case you've got somebody on both ends, and they're usually seen as higher status whether they should be or not, and then you've got people who can't see each other as well. So you really want to have in a meeting a situation where everybody can see each other equally well and have eye contact, because in our culture we can connect that with connection and communication. The next subcategory that we're going to talk about, we're going to skip vocalics and do that in the next lecture, is D, and that is haptics. And haptics refers to touch and communication, and that may be one that you don't think about very much. Of course, the limits of touch are very clearly defined in Western cultures. We know that there are only certain parts of the body that we are allowed to touch on other people, unless, of course, that person is our spouse or significant other, you want to call it that, or if that person is our child and we're taking care of the child, or if we're a medical professional. But beyond those roles, we aren't supposed to touch people in certain places, and it's very clearly defined in our country. Other countries are not quite as specific about it. They might be more physically involved with each other. You might see in some cultures two men walking down the street holding hands. Now that's very different for us, but in some parts of the world that's very acceptable. Haptics is very closely tied to the next one, and that is called proxemics, P-R-O-X-E-M-I-C-S, proxemics. Proxemics, you might see the word proximity there, has to do with physical closeness, how close we get to people, or the use of distance and space in communication. Again, in Western culture, we are very picky about our territory. We call it territoriality. You get into an elevator, your first response is to get as far away from the other person in the elevator as possible. When students come into a room, they stake out their territory, and they will never move for the whole semester. And I've tried to get students to move, and they just are very resistant because they've decided this is their territory and this is where they are going to be. And I would suggest that people move around, but it becomes difficult if you're the only one who moves around and everybody else is sitting in the same place. So we're very territorial. We don't want people to get too physically close to us in our culture. Again, other cultures do not have the same standards, and they're much more comfortable with getting within inches of each other, whereas we are not. So be conscious of that. The next subcategory of communication is one you probably haven't thought about, but it is definitely a type of nonverbal communication, and that is chronemics, C-H-R-O-N-E-M-I-C-S. And you might see the word chron in there, which of course means time. The use of time in communication. And this refers to time as the duration of time, how long something is, as well as being on time, the clock time, if you will. In the United States, we are very, very conscious of clock time. You know, if you go for a job interview and show up half an hour late, you are not going to get that job probably, because we live by the clock. All of our lives, you have heard the expression, time is money, right? Time, we spend it, we save it, we do all kinds of things with time as if it's a physical quantity, but of course it's not. But that's how we think of it as Americans. In other parts of the world, they are not as concerned about clock time and the duration time. You may find that being half an hour late is not seen as a big deal. Another thing in other parts of the world, if you sit down with somebody to go visit them about something, you've got to spend some time with them. You've got to, and hospitality is very important, so they will expect you to drink something and they will want to talk about your family. And in America, we're just sort of like, let's get it over, let's get it done. Even in the South, we're a little bit more that way than perhaps in the North are. People are very, you've heard a New York minute, get it done right now. We're a little bit slower here in the South, but not much compared to the rest of the world. So our standard of chronemics is very different, and that's one thing Americans have had to learn when they go to other cultures. We would not think of spending 3 hours at lunch, but in some cultures that's fine. You sit 3 hours at lunch and just talk and visit and enjoy. So, chronemics is definitely a type of communication, and it's also very status-based. If we knew the president was going to be here at 3 o'clock, we would wait around for the president. We wouldn't worry about him being late. So if he showed up at 5 o'clock, that would be okay because he's the president. So that's one way to think about it. The last one that I want to talk about is objectics. Objectics can be clothing, jewelry, markings, the colors, and then even the furnishings and paintings and things like that in a room. We like to create our own spaces and put our pictures, family, etc. People like to change the color of their hair. If they don't like the color, they're going to be a different color. We choose what we wear. And some people say, well, I don't want to be judged by those things. Well, I would agree with you. I don't want to be judged either. But the reality is that people do judge. My son is looking for a job right now. I hope he finds one soon. And one thing we discuss a lot is how he'll go to job interview and there'll be other people with tattoos. And he doesn't have any, and he's not going to get any. And one reason is because he doesn't want that to interfere with his career in the future. And you might say, well, that's not fair. I have tattoos and people shouldn't judge me. But in some professions, you bet you're going to have to cover them up. That's just the way it is. And maybe that will change sometime. I don't know. But employers get to make those decisions. I want to wrap this up with some summary observations, what I call parting principles of nonverbal communication. You've probably been thinking about times when you were taken in by nonverbal communication and affected by it, and that's interesting to talk about and think about. Maybe nonverbal communication hurt you in a relationship. Maybe you were in a relationship with someone and you just, that person sort of read signals from you that you didn't even know you were sending out. And what happens is that when nonverbal and verbal messages conflict, we generally believe the nonverbal. You might say, well, that's not fair, but that's just the way it is. Another aspect, and this relates to relationships, is that most researchers will agree that women are better at picking up on nonverbal signals than men are. Now you might say, well, they're too sensitive to picking them up, but they will be more conscious of them. And this is one of the reasons for gender differences in communication. We've already seen in this class that nonverbal communication can greatly influence our sense of the credibility and preparedness of a speaker. And that's why I've emphasized practice, 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 and go film yourself in the library so that you can see what you're doing that might be a distraction. If you're constantly pulling at your hair or smacking gum or doing something like that, that's going to be very distracting to the audience and they can't hear you. And finally, as we've seen, nonverbal communication is highly cultural in meaning, and that's one of the main things I want you to get out of this, is be conscious of the fact that people from other cultures and even other parts of the country are going to have different ways of interpreting and seeing and using nonverbal communication, and you shouldn't be judging them or evaluating them on some basis that is not fair.